It began with the smell. Anyone who has worked homicide knows it before they see it. It creeps under doors, seeps through drywall, sticks to your shirt, and lingers in the back of your throat until you taste it in your coffee hours later. Death has a stench no amount of bleach or perfume can disguise. That July in Springfield, Ohio, the heat was merciless. The Midwest was locked in a drought, the kind that turned lawns into dust and made asphalt ripple like tar. The South End apartment blocks were sweating mildew and desperation. Rust streaked down brick walls. Window units rattled like they were coughing their last breath. And kids with nowhere else to go played barefoot in the parking lot, dodging broken glass. But in Building 402, Apartment C, the smell wasn't mildew. It was finality. The neighbors waited too long before calling. That fact stuck with me even before I saw what was inside. Weeks had passed, and no one knocked, no one asked, no one wondered why the tenant was silent. The people in those blocks had learned to keep their heads down. Rent was cheap, walls thin, and curiosity could get you into trouble. In Springfield, silence was safer than kindness. The call came on a Tuesday morning. "Smells like death," the neighbor's voice said, flat and certain. Haven't seen the guy in weeks. I was still new to major crimes, only a year in, which made me fresh enough to feel I should be learning, but old enough to know I wasn't. My partner, Tom Lee, had a decade on me, along with a smoker's growl and a habit of squinting at people like they were puzzles he'd already solved. We drove out in a cruiser that rattled when it hit potholes. Springfield's South End wasn't the sort of place anyone showed visitors. The stores were boarded up or limping along on fumes. Payday loan signs buzzed in flickering neon, and liquor stores doubled as community centers. Captain Johnson had sent us with a dry chuckle. "You rookies need to see what 3 weeks in the heat does to a body." His humor was like his leadership, hard, unsentimental, more instruction than comfort. The building was for stories of brick, gone gray with rain and age. A woman smoked on the stoop, eyes narrowed, watching us like she'd seen cops 100 times before and never expected good news from them. Kids sat on the stairwell, skinny knees poking through torn jeans. No one said a word as we passed. The hallway carpet was long gone, stripped to cracked concrete that smelled of dust and urine. Our shoes echoed, and every sound bounced down the corridor. A television blared from behind one door. A baby cried behind another. But most doors stayed silent, as if the tenants had already agreed they'd pretend not to notice. Apartment C's door was locked. The smell seeped through anyway, thick and unmistakable. Tom muttered, "Yeah, he's in there," and we pried the door with a crowbar. The flies hit us first, a black wave of wings. The air was heavy, humid with rot. Inside, the apartment was shockingly ordinary. That was the part that always unnerved me most, the normalcy. A sofa with fabric worn thin from years of sitting. A stack of children's books on the coffee table. A row of neatly folded shirts on a chair, smelling faintly of detergent. Someone had cared about order here, about making life neat in spite of the chaos outside. But the bathroom ended that illusion. Jack Miller hung from the window latch with a bedsheet tied tight around his neck. His skin had darkened and bloated, splitting at the joints where the heat had accelerated decay. His body was more shaped than man now, a grotesque silhouette swaying in the still air. I forced myself to keep my face neutral, but my stomach clenched. No one ever really gets used to it. You just learn to keep the reaction buried until later. We cut him down. My glove stuck briefly to his skin. Tom swore under his breath, then turned his attention to the kitchen table, where an old flip phone sat. Obsolete, cracked, battery swollen. He thumbed it open while I bagged evidence. The phone contained 7 photographs. A woman, mid-30s, smiling faintly as if trying to remember how. An old woman cradling a toddler on her lap. A little girl with crooked bangs, clutching a book with both hands. And then nothing else. No birthdays, no family portraits, no vacations. Just fragments, brittle pieces of a life too fragile to hold together. The coroner confirmed the ID within the hour. Jonathan Miller, known to most as Jack 38. And with that, my stomach twisted again, not from the stench this time, but from recognition. Jack Miller had been our fugitive. For over a year, he'd been wanted as the prime suspect in the murder of Frank Davis, Springfield's most hated grocer. A locked-room killing that had haunted our unit, confounded the town, and kept his name alive like a shadow. Now, the man who might have explained everything lay rotting on a bathroom floor. Frank Davis. Even now, years later, his name still carries a sourness, like spoiled milk. When people in Springfield remembered him, it was rarely with affection. He was 60 when he died, divorced, estranged from his children, running a corner grocery that seemed to embody every bitterness the neighborhood carried. Oak Street Grocery was a squat building, its sign faded to a pale ghost of blue letters. It sat on the edge of a construction zone where half-finished housing projects stood like skeletons, abandoned when money dried up. The store became a magnet for workers, men who labored under the sun and needed cheap food, cigarettes, or beer before heading home. But steady business didn't mean happy customers. He shortchanged people, one regular told me later, shaking his head. He'd see you sweating, desperate for water, and raise the price a quarter. He'd look you in the eye while he did it. Others said he mocked accents, especially among the Mexican laborers, called them illegals, accused them of stealing even when they had receipts. There were stories of him refusing service just to remind someone they had no power. The more I heard, the more it seemed inevitable that someone would put a knife in him. And eventually, someone did. The night Frank Davis died, the scene looked like a puzzle box. He was found in his bedroom above the store, throat cut cleanly, blood soaking the sheets. No signs of forced entry. No broken locks, no windows pried open. The store's cameras showed no strangers entering. It was the perfect locked-room mystery except for one flaw. The knife was left in the sink, and on its handle were fingerprints belonging to Jack Miller. That evidence was enough to brand him our prime suspect. For over a year, every briefing mentioned his name. His face circulated in bulletins. People whispered theories. Some said he'd fled to Chicago. Others swore they saw him drifting through the South End bars, drinking quietly in the corner. But no arrest was ever made. Until, it seemed, he hanged himself in apartment C. But to understand Jack Miller, you had to step back. He wasn't born a monster. He wasn't even born unlucky, just poor, in a town that punished poverty with relentless efficiency. His father died in a factory accident when Jack was 11. His mother, Helen, scrubbed offices at night and came home too tired to cook. Jack became the man of the house before he was old enough to shave. At 16, he left school to haul bricks and shovel dirt. He was big, broad-shouldered, with hands already calloused. The older men respected his work ethic. He didn't complain, didn't cut corners. By his 20s, he was running crews, directing men twice his age. It was during those years that Frank Davis cheated him. Davis had a side business then, contracting small projects. Jack and 5 others framed houses, poured concrete, and carried lumber for weeks. Payday came, and Davis vanished with the wages. Jack never forgot. Years later, when he ran into Davis at a bar, the anger erupted. Words turned to fists. Davis ended up with a broken leg, Jack with a charge of aggravated assault. He served a year, came out with a record that made honest work nearly impossible. Employers glanced at his file and looked away. Still, he tried to build a life. He met Maria Lopez at a diner, where she waitressed under a false name. She had crossed the border years earlier, slipping into the shadows of Springfield, where undocumented workers washed dishes, cleaned houses, and hoped to stay invisible. Maria was gentle, soft-spoken, with eyes that seemed always tired, yet kind. Jack fell in love with her patience. They married quietly in a friend's basement. No paperwork, no license. Just a promise. A year later, their daughter Anna was born. For a time, the Miller apartment was full of laughter. Jack took drywall jobs, Maria cooked beans and rice, and Anna toddled around with dolls. Jack would hold her at night and whisper about the future. One day you'll have a yard. You'll run barefoot, Anna, not in parking lots, grass. But fate doesn't spare men like Jack. Helen's illness grew worse. She coughed blood, her body thinning to bones. Hospitals turned her away, no insurance, no charity. Jack begged for help, but forms and bills choked every attempt. She died apologizing for being a burden. Weeks later, Anna choked on a piece of candy. Maria panicked, frozen, unable to act. By the time Jack rushed home, Anna lay limp in her mother's arms. Maria rocked her, whispering, "She's just sleeping." Maria broke after that. She wandered at night, carrying pots of food, muttering about family dinners. One evening, she stepped into the road, soup sloshing from the bowl she clutched. A car hit her before anyone could stop it. By the time Jack reached her, The soup had spilled into the dirt, steam rising as her body cooled. 1 month, 3 funerals. Neighbors said Jack changed overnight. He set 3 plates at dinner, food spoiling untouched. They saw him talking to empty chairs, smiling at shadows. He became hollow, carrying ghosts like they were strapped to his shoulders. When I joined Major Crimes, I thought the job was about catching villains. But the more cases I worked, the more I realized our city wasn't filled with masterminds. It was filled with forgotten men. Men like Jack, beaten down until they cracked. Captain Johnson used to say, "Most killers we meet aren't evil. They're exhausted." At the time, I thought he was just being cynical. But standing in Jack's apartment, staring at the flip phone with its fragments of family, I started to believe him. The morning after we cut Jack down, the squad room smelled of burnt coffee and paper. Reports piled on my desk like refs. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the air conditioner coughed out stale air that never seemed to cool the room. Tom sat across from me, rubbing his temples. Captain Johnson leaned on the doorway, his tie-crooked eyes narrowed like he was trying to see through walls. Amy Turner, our newest detective, perched on the edge of her chair with a notebook in her lap. She was fresh from academy, still believing answers could be found if you looked hard enough. "Let's hear it," Johnson said. I cleared my throat, flipping through my notes. Male 38, identified as Jonathan Miller, found hanged in his bathroom. Neighbors confirmed he'd been missing for weeks. Body consistent with that timeline. And the phone, Amy asked. 7 photographs. All family. No recent calls. No texts. Phone itself was old, almost obsolete. Tom exhaled smoke into an already stale room. Coroner confirmed it. I hesitated. Coroner confirmed the ID, but I glanced at my notes. He mentioned inconsistencies. Bone wear, dental records. Age might skew closer to mid-40s. Johnson's eyebrows rose. So maybe not Jack. Silence stretched. The hum of the lights seemed louder. Finally, Tom said, "If that's not Miller, then who the hell did we cut down yesterday?" That question haunted me as we canvassed the neighborhood. Apartment 402's hallway was lined with residents who answered the door reluctantly, eyes darting past us as if worried someone else might be watching. Most were used to cops only showing up for raids or warrants. Cooperation wasn't a habit. One neighbor, a woman in her 50s with curlers in her hair, leaned on the doorframe. "Quiet guy," she said. "Didn't bother nobody. Sometimes I'd hear him talking at night. Thought he had company, but she shook her head. He lived alone, far as I know." Another tenant muttered. "I saw him carrying groceries. Always the same stuff. Bread, beans, cheap meat. Never saw no wife. No kid." He scratched at his arm. "But once I swear I saw a little girl in his window. Curtains drawn back. Just for a second." At the corner bar, men hunched over cheap beers told a different story. The South End bar was dim, smelling of spilled whiskey and fryer grease. A jukebox sat silent, its colored lights flickering like tired eyes. "You're asking about Jack," one man said, his face red from drink. "He was one of us. Worked hard. Got screwed harder. Davis treated him like trash. Treated all of us like trash." He took a long pull on his beer. Nobody cried when Davis bled out. "You want to know the truth? Jack had reason," another man cut in. "Reason don't mean he did it. Half this town had reason." Their voices rose, overlapping, bitterness simmering just below the surface. These weren't men who trusted police. They were men who had seen too many friends buried under debt, too many wages stolen, too many lives dismissed as expendable. In their eyes, Davis's death wasn't a crime, it was balance. Springfield wasn't unique. I'd grown up in a town like it, all factories and fields, slowly gutted when industry left. Empty warehouses stood like mausoleums, and the people who stayed behind were left to fight over scraps. The grocery store, the gas station, the church, the Barthies were the last landmarks holding the town together, but beneath it all was a quiet hostility. Outsiders weren't welcome. Immigrants were tolerated only when their labor was cheap. Families lived in fear of medical bills, one illness away from ruin. Police were seen less as protectors and more as enforcers-collectors for a system that never cared. It was in this soil that men like Jack Miller grew, rooted in hardship, watered in neglect, left to twist toward whatever light they could find. At the hospital, I met a nurse who remembered Maria Lopez. She hesitated before speaking, eyes scanning the corridor to make sure no one else listened. She came here once with her daughter, the nurse whispered. Anna had a fever. High, dangerous. We told her without insurance, we couldn't admit them. She cried, begged, said she'd pay anything. But it doesn't work that way. She looked down at her shoes. They walked out. I never saw them again. It wasn't unusual. Hospitals turned away the uninsured all the time. Children, elderly, it didn't matter. In Springfield, sickness was expensive, and the poor couldn't afford to be ill. That detail dug under my skin. It painted Maria's fear in sharper colors, explained the exhaustion in her eyes. She had lived every day with the knowledge that one accident, one cough, could destroy her family. And in the end, it had. Back at the precinct, Tom tapped his ash into an overfilled tray. You know what bothers me, he said. What doesn't? I asked. The photo, the one with the 6 men. He leaned forward. That wasn't just nostalgia. That was a record, a message. Amy frowned. But the other photos were family. Why would he keep a work photo with him? Because those men mattered, Tom said. They weren't just co-workers. They were something else. I nodded. A pact. Johnson's voice carried across the room. Then find them. Every one of them. We tracked down the men in the photograph one by one. Most still lived in or around Springfield, though their lives had scattered like leaves in the wind. Joe Carter worked nights at a factory that made cardboard boxes, his hands stained with glue. Mike Ramirez drove a beat-up delivery van for a furniture store. Luis Ortega tended bar. Ben Holloway collected disability checks after a back injury. Carl Jensen had vanished entirely, last known address a trailer that now sat empty. The more we dug, the more connections to Frank Davis emerged. Every man had been cheated, insulted, humiliated by him at one time or another. They spoke of him with the bitterness of men still nursing old wounds. Yet when asked about Jack Miller, their tones softened. Jack was different, Luis said in the bar, polishing glasses as he spoke. He had this dignity. Even after everything, he didn't whine, he didn't blame. He just kept moving, like carrying a load too heavy, but refusing to drop it. Mike leaned forward. We all knew what Davis did to him. To us, but Jack carried it worse. He lost more. Wife, kid, mother. You could see it in his eyes, like he was walking around half dead already. The puzzle was tightening. These weren't random men. They were a circle, bound by shared pain. We brought Joe Carter in first. He sat across the steel table, fidgeting, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. A recorder clicked on. I sat opposite Tom beside me, Amy watching silently from the corner. Joe, I began, voice calm. We need to talk about Jack Miller. He looked at the floor. What about him? You knew him. Yeah. Everyone knew Jack. I slid the photograph across the table. You were there? With him? His picture construction crew, 20 years ago. All of you worked for Frank Davis. His jaw tightened. So what? So Frank Davis ends up dead. Jack's prints are on the knife. And yet, something doesn't add up. I leaned closer. Help me understand. For a long time, he was silent. The hum of the fluorescent light filled the room. Then his shoulders sagged. Jack didn't kill Davis, he said finally. Then who did? I asked. All of us. The words hung heavy, as though the air itself thickened. Joe continued, voice low, halting. Jack wanted justice, or revenge. Call it what you want. But his heart wasn't strong. He'd been broken too long. That night, he collapsed before he could finish it. We couldn't let him go down alone. So we did it, together. You staged it, I said. He nodded. We made it look like Jack, so he'd carry the weight. So Davis's blood would be his story, not ours. He wanted it that way, even if he never said the words. Tom spoke for the first time, voice like gravel, and the body in that apartment was that Jack. Joe's eyes flickered. No, the room went silent. Then where is he? Amy asked. Joe shook his head. Gone. Dead. Maybe. Or maybe not. We never saw him after that night. But we swore, all of us, that if the law came knocking, we'd confess. Each one of us. The coroner's doubts now loomed larger. The body's bone where the dental inconsistencies. It wasn't Jack Miller. It was someone else. Someone left hanging to close a story the town had already decided on. I drove home that night with the windows down, letting the summer air wash over me. The town blurred past empty factories, neon beer signs, the hushed glow of a church where a janitor swept the steps. Springfield was full of ghosts, but not the kind you could bury. Years later, after my own car accident left me laid up in recovery, I told this story to another patient. He listened with rapt attention, eyes wide. "So who killed Frank Davis?" he asked finally. I thought of Joe's tired face, of Luis behind the bar, of Mike hunched over his van, of Jack Miller's hollow apartment filled with shadows. "All of them," I said, "and none of them. Depends on how you define justice. Maybe Jack died in that apartment. Maybe he didn't. Maybe his friends built a legend around him so that his name would bear the weight of their act. The truth. America is full of forgotten men like Jack. Men ground down by debt, by illness, by the quiet cruelty of a system that looks the other way. Men who live entire lives without ever appearing on paper. Men who vanish until even memory grows thin. Most disappear without a sound. But Jack Miller, for better or worse, will not be forgotten."